Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, understanding China through the life of its most famous dissident.
One of the inspiring things about Chinese people like Liu Xiaobo is how they pushed for ideals even in the darkest of hours. And I think that that's inspiring no matter where you come from on the political spectrum and no matter what era or what culture you come from.
My guest is Ian Johnson, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and researcher. He's also one of two winners this year of the Washington Monthly's Kukula Award for excellence in nonfiction book reviewing. His award-winning review, published in the New York Review of Books, was a critique of I Have No Enemies, The Life and Legacy of Liu Xiaobo by Perry Link and Wu Dazhi. Welcome, Ian, to the show, and great to meet you. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. It's my honor to be on the show.
I want to ask you first about your review. You chose to review a 550-page biography that you yourself noted has been, quote, all but shunned by the mainstream media, with substantive reviews only appearing in two publications, the Los Angeles Review of Books and the China Books Review, and there was a one-paragraph review in Foreign Affairs. So why did you choose this book, and what did you see as its significance?
Well, I thought the topic itself was in some ways a slam dunk because the topic of the biography, Liu Xiaobo, is the only Chinese Nobel Peace Prize laureate, excluding the Dalai Lama. And so in that sense, I think he's an important historical figure. He died in custody in prison, making him the first Nobel Peace Prize laureate to die since a German journalist died during the Nazi era. And the biographers included Perry Link, who's probably one of the most distinguished and important scholars of Chinese literature and dissent over the past, half century or something like that, as well as a Chinese colleague who went by a pseudonym, but also a well-known person. So I thought the combination of subject and an author just made this a really important book, an inherently important book. It's a kind of book that I think, whether it's good or bad, it should be reviewed. I think like in some ways, sometimes a bad book, people will say, don't bother reviewing it because it's not worth it. But this is such an important book, and there haven't been really very many biographies of Liu Xiaobo, no major comprehensive biographies. So I thought, this has got to be reviewed.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things about your review was that you spent probably the first 2/3 actually talking about the details of Liu's life. And I can tell you that there are a lot of things that I didn't know, even though he is China's most famous dissident. And probably a lot of Americans didn't know a lot of the details about his life. And I'm wondering if that was part of the goal of your review, simply just to educate Americans about this really remarkable figure that is not as well known as he should be in America.
Absolutely. I think that one of the tragedies of the Chinese dissident movement is that, on the one hand, some people do take it very seriously, but I think that it's often been kind of overshadowed or ignored in our view of China, because we tend to be, especially for the past 40 years, or certainly 30 years, the story has been of China going upward and becoming an economic juggernaut. And when I was in China, starting out as a correspondent in the 1990s, that was the story. Later, I joined the Wall Street Journal as a macroeconomics reporter and covered China's accession to the WTO. And it was all about China's rising, and they're going to eat our lunch. And, people would go to China like Tom Friedman or every once in a while and say, my goodness, a Shanghai taxi driver told me they're going to eat our lunch and whatever. I'm just joking. But I just think that that's been the dominant story. Now it's like China, the big scary superpower that's got hypersonic missiles and is threatening Taiwan and is secretly backing Putin in Ukraine. And those are all perfectly valid and important stories, China, AI, etc. But there's also a kind of a misstory, which is the universality of Chinese thought, and that there are Chinese people, just like everywhere in the world, who want to be able to express themselves, who want to participate in their government in some ways. And it sort of irked me that these people, like Liu Xiaobo, he's the epitome perhaps of that, were not better known in the West, whereas a generation or two ago, their equivalents in the Soviet Union were very well known and were taken much more seriously.
Well, I'm wondering if Americans are going to be more interested now in techniques of dissidence, if nothing else, given everything that's happened now. And I'm wondering if you see if part of your reason for writing this also was um, the relevance here in America today. And maybe your review is more relevant now than even when it was published.
Yeah, I think that one of the inspiring things about China and Chinese people like Liu Xiaobo is how they pushed for ideals even in the darkest of hours. That in the hardest of times, that people like this still stood up and still wanted to be counted. And I think that that's inspiring no matter where you come from on the political spectrum and no matter what era or what culture you come from, just to see that there are people like that.
Yeah. Another interesting aspect about your review is the fact that you talk about how much Liu knew a lot about America, even though Americans don't know much about him, right? He studied at Columbia University, he studied at the University of Hawaii. He was an advocate of the westernization of China to some extent. And you had talked about kind of these misperceptions of Chinese history in American eyes. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how Liu's life better explains the arc of Chinese history in 20th century through today, and why he is the right prism for understanding China more broadly.
Yeah, Liu was born about a decade after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. And he's really a product of that system. He grew up in a communist party ecosystem when China was closed off to the outside world. His father was an academic who worked for a state-run university, and they suffered a little bit in the Mao era, but he grew up with the children, the offspring of generals, and so on and so forth. And after Mao died in the late 1970s, and China embarked on what's known as the reform era, where they turned their back on planned economics and so on, Liu really embraced that period and became probably its best known public intellectual. He was a bit naive, and so his life story follows this arc, I think, of how Chinese intellectuals dealt with the outside world, especially in that era over the past half century. He was, as you said, an advocate of full-scale Westernization of China. At times, he sort of said there's nothing of value in Chinese culture, which he was a bit of an iconoclast. He liked to exaggerate and things like that. But I think he really embraced a lot of that, which is what a lot of people in China felt also in the 1980s, that we need to throw ourselves open to the outside world. We have to learn from the West and so on and so forth. But then when the Chinese system proved to be more durable than perhaps he had hoped, especially after Tiananmen, the massacre, the party puts the stake in the ground and says, no, nothing, no way we're going to have political reform like that. We're not going to have a Gorbachev style revolution with the Communist Party folding. Then he has to think of other ways to challenge the party. And he's really influenced by a very famous Chinese novelist, Wang Xiaobo, who talked about the silent majority of people in China who are in some ways victims of the system. People who may be farmers, who may be miners, who don't have workers' rights, who don't have freedom of speech. They may be of a different sexual orientation. And Liu Xiaobo embraced this idea and embraced the idea of trying to improve things at the local level for these people. So instead of big grandiose statements about freedom of expression and democracy, he began to work for the rights of these people on a smaller level. And that became his modus operandi from the late 1990s until his imprisonment after the Beijing Olympics in 2008. And I think that's a really interesting
Huh.
trajectory. And then, of
Yeah, that
course, his
really is.
incarceration. No, go ahead, sir.
No. Go ahead. Just going to ask you some more details about how he actually did this grassroots work. Like, what were the mechanisms by which he spread the message that he was trying to get across? And how did that bubble up into a nationwide movement?
Yeah, it was not just thought of by Liu Xiaobo, but there was a group of public intellectuals at the time, a group of people who had the idea. In a way, it was they were drawing on ideas from Eastern and Central Europe. But the way they did it in the late 1990s was to make use of the internet. And I think now we know that the internet can be easily controlled, it can be manipulated, it can create these echo chambers where people are not being informed. But at that time, in the late 1990s, there was a lot of optimism about the internet, and it wasn't so tightly censored in China. So there would be examples of, say, somebody in a local town would find a factory that was egregiously polluting the local water supply and just turning it black with pollution and killing all the fish, and all of the irrigation networks were destroyed and the crops were failing because of the pollution. And they could go and take videos of this using new digital technologies of video cameras and so on and post it on blogs or on social media, which eventually started to come up in the 2000s as well. And this would create pressure on the government to change things. And this was a tactic that the government, that these activists rather, used time and again also for women's rights, for a very famous case of a woman who was killed by her boyfriend, for example, to protest against violence against women. And they use these cases that became celebrated, national cases, as ways of pushing the government for some sort of change. And I think that was his interesting contribution for about a decade.
And then you started to talk about his imprisonment, and that also became a catalyst.
Yeah, I mean, so his arc does unfortunately continue on into the 2010s when the government, by which time the government is no longer so open. So there was this kind of golden age of Chinese civil society from the mid 1990s, you could say roughly, until about 2010. This is, give or take a couple of years on either end. But this was a time when there was interesting independent Chinese journalism. There were bloggers, there were social media activists, there was a great independent movement for documentary films. About 200 independent documentary films were made at this time, sometimes detailing and dissecting issues such as pollution in a local area or problems with policies toward ethnic minorities in China. This all was done by people making use of digital technologies like digital cameras and PDFs in order to write books or to resurrect books that had been banned in the past. You could then reprint them essentially as a PDF and email them to people and get around censorship like that. So there was this great period, but it came to an end, I think, when the party realized, or they felt, that the pendulum had gone too far, and they saw what had happened in the Soviet Union. And Xi Jinping epitomizes that trend. He has spoken very openly about the fall of the Soviet Union being a great catastrophe, and that it was basically because it was undermined by too much civil society. So the party collectively decided in the late 2000s, we need to change this. And they picked somebody they thought who could essentially crack down a little bit harder than had happened before. And so in 2008, this is before Xi Jinping took power, but as part of that overall trend, Liu Xiaobo was detained and then eventually sentenced.
He passed away in 2017, I believe, right? And what's happened to the Chinese dissidents movement since then?
Well, it's a dark period for people inside China who are pushing for political change. It's not as bad as in the Mao era, let's say, but it's still a time when these channels that I talked about before during that golden era, somewhat independent journalism, the internet,
Mm-hmm.
and these kinds of things have all been closed down systematically by the government, which has made a full court press to rein these in. And yet there are still people working and trying, and there's still people making movies, and there's still people editing books and underground journals and things like that. It's just that they don't have a public platform anymore. these independent documentary films that I mentioned before, there used to be independent film festivals and people would go watch these films. Now it's impossible. You can just share it in a file with file sharing or something like that, but you don't have the public sphere anymore for it.
Um, Now, you have been covering China for 35 years, and you have won a Pulitzer for this work, and you're working on a new book about China, I understand. Can you tell us a little bit about what this new book will be about?
Well, what I'm interested now is about how people inside and outside China in the Chinese speaking world are cooperating and collaborating to keep alive these ideals of the golden age, so to keep alive the ideas of freedom of expression, things like that. These are people who often have very different ideas, but they aren't all united under one umbrella, but they have in general a desire for a more open, a more tolerant China. So I'm working on some sort of a project like that. I haven't yet got it all organized, but it's along those lines. I spent a lot of my effort actually in running a nonprofit, a 501c3 that I put together called the China Unofficial Archives, which is a platform for this kind of independent thought in China. We have over 1,000 items, including films and books and magazines, and try to preserve these things from vanishing. So we digitize movies and magazines and things like that and put it up there for free, no paywall or registration required. And we have a newsletter, and about a third of our readers come from inside China, which is heartening. So you can see people are able to jump over the firewall in China. They use VPNs and other technology like that. So that's what I've been spending actually a lot of my time working on that project.
That's a really cool project. That's a really cool project. I do want to go back to this question of American perceptions of China, um, because so few people know about the fact of the existence of Chinese dissidents and the arc of the life of someone like Liu. One of the things you wrote in your review was you wrote, many people view China as deserving little more than opprobrium. Many political leaders and commentators treat China as a country to be contained, but not engaged. What do
Yeah,
you mean by, yeah, what do you mean by engagement in this
yeah,
context?
this word has become almost taboo in the United States. It's been viewed as some sort of appeasement policy that failed in the
Mm,
2000s or 2010s. There was this kind of straw man argument that people who were in favor of engagement thought that China would democratize if it embraced, say, market economics and so on, and it didn't democratize, and therefore the whole thing failed. But I think engagement is important on several levels. One way of looking at China, and this has been the policy of various organizations, including at times the US government, is to see China in three dimensions. One is as a systemic rival, which it is. It is a rival to the United States on many ways. As an economic competitor, which it is indefinitely, but also as a potential partner for cooperation on certain areas, such as, say, terrorism or drugs or the climate, which maybe in the current government in Washington, that's not such a priority, but which might become a priority again. And I think that this area, I think regardless of how you view China, you have to engage with the country. You have to have people, you have to have young people going there to study. You have to go visit it and go see it. It's a country that I think demands our attention. We can't just wish it away and simply put up enough trade sanctions and tariffs that we can somehow contain it like that. It's something that it's much more sophisticated than, say, the Soviet Union was half a century ago. It's not something that you can simply call an evil empire and use military means to isolate. China is a really successful economic player. It's going to be dominating major technologies for the 21st century, and we have to understand it better. And that requires encouraging young people to study Chinese. And it's very depressing to see how few people now are studying Chinese. There are some admittedly, foreign languages at universities is going down across the board, but there are some
right.
exceptions. And I think that Chinese should be something that people should want to study, not just for some realpolitik point of view, but because it's a really important and interesting country, and it offers solutions to problems that we all grapple with. The way that they are rolling out renewable energy, for example, that's interesting and impressive. And it's not just some kind of, Hitler built the Autobahn explanation of authoritarian states can do whatever they want. There's more to it. There's a dynamism in China that's very real and still has to be understood and experienced. And so I think that kind of engagement, not a naive engagement, but an
Mm-hmm.
engagement and understanding of what China is, keeping in mind people like Liu Xiaobo and the fate that that befell them, but still wanting to understand this country.
Yeah, yeah. And China just had a remarkable announcement at the United Nations, making a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's
Yeah, it was quite a contrast. I mean, Trump was basically saying it's all a hokum, and you guys are if you follow green policies, you're entirely wrong. China, meanwhile, is charging down the path of renewables. Admittedly, they are still the world's largest polluter and an
sure.
emitter of greenhouse gases. So there's a bit of a
Mm,
conundrum there, but they are going to potentially own these technologies, especially because they're subsidizing them, they're adopting them, whereas we're not. We're looking at it skeptically as if it doesn't exist. But in some ways, our policy is a bit like the Flat Earth Society. I mean, the world is actually round, it isn't flat, and we have to deal with the fact that there is climate change, it is real, and those kind of technologies are going to be really important in the future. I think sometimes this is perhaps an advantage of having a country where it is, of course, an authoritarian state. It is brutal and harsh, but the people running the country are not deluded. They understand what's happening. They'll still build coal-fired power plants because they need the energy and they want to keep producing, and they can't afford to have unemployment, and for various reasons, but they know where the future is and they want they want to own the future. And so should we. But I think in that sense, it's also another example of how in China there is this embrace of the future. Whereas in the United States, you get the feeling that the future is just this big, horrible, scary thing that we've got to somehow avoid one way or another, whether it's sticking our head in the sand or what. But I think in China, there's this
yeah.
idea that we're going to own the 21st century. And I think America had that last century, but it doesn't feel like that the United States has that mojo anymore, but China
Yeah,
still
no.
has it.
Yeah, it's about embracing the past in a
Yeah,
lot of
yeah, it's
ways, whether it's fossil
going
fuels
back.
or manufacturing or, right, old-fashioned ideas about what families need to look like. There is definitely a retrograde
Yeah,
flavor to,
yeah. I know you see some of that in China too. I mean, Xi Jinping is very much a guy who thinks, men should be men, women should be women. It's a very hard time for feminists in China.
mm,
It's a very hard time for LGBTQ plus organizations. So it's not a great time in China right now for those groups either.
yeah, yeah. Well, Ian Johnson, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us and for this review of a remarkable figure in history. Really appreciate the chance to
Thank you
talk
very
with
much
you.
for having me on.
Take care. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.